It's past 1 in the morning on a cold November night in 2008. In a silent suburban estate on the outskirts of Limerick Island, 28-year-old Shane Geoghegan strolls home after watching a rugby match with friends. He's just texted his girlfriend, Jenna Barry, "Be home in a minute," at 12:54 a.m. Residents of the Kiltaraw estate are asleep or winding down. This is a peaceful neighbourhood, far removed from the gangland violence Limerick has become infamous for. Suddenly, the stillness is broken by sharp cracks in the night. Jenna startles at the sound of gunfire right outside their home. Rushing to the window, she catches a glimpse of a figure sprinting away and leaping into a dark van as someone yells, "Drive!" Tires screech, and the vehicle hurtles off into darkness. Jenna's heart pounds. She fumbles her phone to dial 999, fearing the worst. She sends a frantic text to Shane. "I think there's been a shooting." No reply. Moments later, on a nearby lawn, a mortally wounded young man slumps against a wall and slides to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Shane Geoghegan wasn't a celebrity or a criminal. He was by all accounts a nice, decent guy who was well respected by young and old alike, as the secretary of his rugby club later said. Born and raised in Limerick, Shane was known for his friendly smile and love of sport. By 2008, he worked as an aircraft fitter for Air Atlanta and spent his free time on the rugby pitch. As a prop forward for Gary Owen Rugby Club, he'd even captained the club's thirds team, mentoring younger players for the love of the game. Shane lived in the Doyle area with his longtime girlfriend Jenna, and the two were building a quiet life together. On Saturday, November 8th, 2008, Shane had led his rugby team to victory, then spent the evening relaxing with friends, watching Ireland's national team play a match on TV. It was an ordinary, happy day in his ordinary, happy life. What Shane didn't know was that night, danger lurked in the shadows of his neighbourhood. Unbeknownst to him, a local criminal gang had marked someone in Doyle for death, and a hitman was lying in wait. Shane Geoghegan had absolutely no connection to any gang. He was an innocent man who happened to resemble the intended target of a gangland assassination. In a cruel twist of fate, walking home at just the wrong moment would put him in the crosshairs. To understand how such a terrible mistake could happen, we need to talk about Limerick in the 2000s. This Irish city had been living under the shadow of a bitter underworld feud between two rival gangs, the McCarthy-Dundon gang and the Keane-Colopy gang. Their war over the drug trade had turned parts of Limerick into virtual battlefields. By 2008, at least 13 people had been murdered in these gang conflicts. There were drive-by shootings, pipe bomb attacks, abductions, even torture. A level of violence that earned Limerick an unwelcome nickname in the press. Stab City. Residents of certain neighbourhoods lived in fear, and the Gardaí, Ireland's national police, were under tremendous pressure to rein in the chaos. Doyle, where Shane lived, is a normally quiet suburb, not the kind of place you'd associate with gangland crimes. But Limerick is a small city. Worlds can collide. One of the gangland figures caught up in the feud was a man named John McNamara, known on the streets as Pitchfork McNamara. He was a drug dealer aligned with the Keane-Colopy side, a mortal enemy of the McCarthy-Dundon gang. And as fate would have it, John McNamara lived just a few doors down from Shane Geoghegan's home in the Clonmore area of Kiltaraw, Doyle. In early November 2008, the McCarthy-Dundon gang decided to take McNamara out. They enlisted a hitman, a young Dublin native who had recently moved to Limerick, and armed him with a semi-automatic Glock pistol. Their plan was simple and deadly. Wait for McNamara under cover of darkness and shoot him dead near his home. It didn't matter that the quiet housing estate was filled with families and working people. The gang war had no boundaries, orders were given, and the hit was set in motion. But there was a problem. The hitman didn't actually know John McNamara by sight. He'd only been in Limerick a couple of months. He would have to rely entirely on the description provided by the gang boss coordinating the attack, a description that would prove fatally imprecise. On top of that, fate intervened in a tragic way. One of the only streetlights on Shane's route home that night happened to be burned out, cloaking the area in gloom. In the darkness, an innocent man walking home could easily be mistaken for the intended target. The stage was set for a tragedy. In the early minutes of Sunday, November 9th, 2008, Shane Geoghegan said his goodbyes to friends after the rugby watch party and started the short walk back to his house. It was only about a 2-minute stroll through the residential streets of Clonmore, which he'd walked countless times. Shane likely had no sense of danger as he cut through the chilly night. He was almost home, close enough that Jenna was still awake, expecting him any moment. Parked nearby in the shadows was a Renault Espace van, the hit team's getaway vehicle. Inside sat at least 2 men, the 23-year-old gunman, Barry Doyle, and an accomplice at the wheel. They had been tipped off that their target, John McNamara, might be out that night. According to later testimony, the gang boss had briefed them well. He had everything sussed out about John McNamara, where he hung out when he'd be home, and now it was time to make the move. Doyle had been told exactly what McNamara looked like and assured that the gun and the car and everything was sorted. The order from the top was brutally clear. The gun is there. You kill him. As Shane walked along the quiet street, it seems Barry Doyle mistook him for the target. Maybe Shane's build and hair matched McNamara's general description in the dim light. Maybe Doyle saw Shane turn toward a house on the same cul-de-sac and assumed this was the spot. Whatever the case, at approximately 1 a.m., the hitman sprang into action. He stepped out of the car, raised the Glock, and opened fire. Gunshots echoed through the estate as Doyle squeezed the trigger repeatedly. Shane realized instantly he was under attack. Neighbors later recalled hearing up to 15 shots ring out in rapid succession. Bullets whizzed past, and Shane ran for his life, desperately seeking cover. He managed to sprint into a narrow back garden behind a house. His own home was literally just yards away. But in that back garden, Doyle cornered him. Shane was unarmed and defenseless. Doyle later admitted what happened next in chilling detail. In his confession to police, he said he chased Shane into the garden and caught up as Shane paused, perhaps wounded or out of breath. He was leaning against the wall when I shot him, Doyle recounted, and he just slid down. Standing just feet away, the gunman pointed the pistol at Shane's head and fired the fatal shots. One bullet struck the back of Shane's head, severing his brainstem, causing instant, catastrophic injury. Another tore through his upper body. In all, Shane Geoghegan was hit 5 times in the head and torso at close range. He never stood a chance. Within moments, the assassins realized the neighborhood was waking up from the noise. Porch lights flicked on. Someone shouted. Doyle dashed back to the waiting Renault Espace, adrenaline pumping. Jenna Barry, hearing those gunshots and seeing the commotion outside, watched a man run to a vehicle and heard tires screeching as it sped off. She immediately called the Gardaí's emergency line and, in panic, shot off a text to Shane's phone, warning him there'd been a shooting outside. Unbeknownst to her, Shane lay collapsed just around the corner, gravely wounded. The getaway car disappeared into the night. It was later found abandoned and burned out not far from the scene, a common gang tactic to destroy evidence. The quiet Dora Doyle estate was left stunned and confused in the gunfire's aftermath. As neighbors cautiously emerged, they came upon an awful sight on the dew-damp grass behind a house on Clonmore Road, Shane's body lying motionless in the darkness. One resident's fearful call had already summoned help, and within minutes, Garda patrol cars and members of the Armed Regional Support Unit descended on the area. Medics could do nothing for the young man on the ground. Shane Geoghegan was pronounced dead at the scene from multiple gunshot wounds to his head and body. The first officers secured the area, their flashlights cutting beams through the dark as they searched for clues. They quickly found chilling evidence of what had occurred, blood on the garden wall where Shane had tried to hide, and spent 9mm shell casings littering the street and yard. In fact, investigators recovered 2 live rounds that had failed to fire. The Glock had jammed during the attack, and Doyle had manually cleared it to keep shooting. This detail, revealed by Doyle himself later, matched the scene exactly and helped prove that his account of the murder was genuine. The sheer number of shots and the precision of the killing left little doubt. This was a professional hit. But why on earth would anyone want Shane Geoghegan dead? To the tight-knit Dora Doyle community, Shane was known only as a polite, sports-loving guy with no enemies. In the early hours of that morning, as yellow crime scene tape went up around their cul-de-sac, neighbours huddled in disbelief and grief. The awful realization would soon dawn. Shane wasn't the intended target at all. An innocent man had been slain by mistake. News of the killing spread quickly through Limerick on Sunday. When it emerged that the victim was Shane Geoghegan, a beloved local rugby player with absolutely no criminal ties, public shock turned to outrage. This was a tipping point. Gang violence had been terrorizing the city for years, but now an innocent sportsman had been brutally gunned down on his own doorstep. It was a nightmare come to life for Limerick's people, who feared that anyone could become collateral damage in the gang feud. That Sunday and the days following saw an outpouring of grief. A makeshift shrine of flowers, rugby jerseys, and handwritten notes grew outside Shane's home and at Garryowen Rugby Club, where he'd spent so many happy days. A solemn funeral was planned for midweek, and the city prepared to pay respects. On Wednesday, November 12th, thousands lined the streets of Limerick for Shane's funeral procession. St. Joseph's Church overflowed with about 2,000 mourners, including Shane's heartbroken family, friends and teammates. Even members of Ireland's rugby elite came to honour him. National team stars like Jerry Flannery, David Wallace and Ian Redden, a former schoolmate of Shane's, stood alongside former Ireland head coach Eddie O'Sullivan in silent respect. These were household names in Irish sport, and their presence signalled just how much Shane meant to the rugby community. The Bishop of Limerick presiding over the Mass condemned the killing as utterly senseless. In tribute, before Ireland's next rugby international that week, and again when the famed New Zealand All Blacks came to play Munster at Thomond Park, players and fans observed a minute of silence for Shane Geoghegan. His club Garryowen retired the number 3 jersey, Shane's number, for the rest of the season across all its teams. These gestures reverberated nationwide. Shane's death had struck a nerve far beyond Limerick. Expressions of sympathy and fury poured in. In the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, lawmakers decried the murder as an obscenity that could not be tolerated in a civilised society. Dermot Ahern, Ireland's Minister for Justice at the time, voiced the raw anger felt by many when he publicly branded the killers as scum. The outrage was not just about Shane's death, but what it represented: criminal gangs acting with impunity and innocent lives being lost as a result. Ireland's Prime Minister and President offered condolences to the Geoghegan family, and there were urgent calls to intensify the crackdown on Limerick's gangs. Ordinary citizens too were saying, enough is enough. Shane's killing became a rallying point for the community's resolve to stand up to gang terror. While the city mourned, the Gardaí mobilised a massive investigation. They promised to leave no stone unturned to get justice for Shane. And indeed, the scale of the police response was unprecedented for Limerick. Up to 200 Garda officers were assigned to the case, with 50 working on it every single day. Within 48 hours of the murder, on November 14th, 2008, Garda teams launched coordinated raids on more than 20 addresses across Limerick, as well as in counties Cork and Dublin. Doors were kicked in at the homes of known gang figures, safe houses, anywhere that might hide clues or suspects. These searches yielded a haul of illegal items, handguns, ammunition, drugs, as investigators swept up anyone and anything possibly linked to Shane's shooting. The pressure on the criminal underworld was intense. In fact, one of the leading members of the McCarthy-Dundon crime family was so unnerved by the backlash that he turned himself into police within a week of the murder. Not to confess, but out of fear that he might be killed next in retaliation. Such was the climate of paranoia after the botched hit. Even hardened gangsters were looking over their shoulders. Early on, detectives began hearing whispers that the plan had been to kill John McNamara, and that the killers had tragically gotten the wrong man. The evidence on the ground supported this theory. Shane had no reason to be targeted, whereas McNamara, living nearby, was deeply embroiled in the feud. Neighbours reported that a black car, matching McNamara's car, had been seen around, and one crucial detail stood out. Shane and John McNamara bore a resemblance to each other. They were similar in height and build, and at a distance or under poor lighting, one could be mistaken for the other. Investigators quickly concluded that Shane Geoghegan's murder was a horrific case of mistaken identity. This fact only added to the public horror. An innocent man killed over someone else's war, and steeled the resolve of the Gardaí to catch those responsible. Shane's family, meanwhile, through their unimaginable grief, did something remarkable. They went on national television to help the investigation. Just over a week after the murder, on November 18th, 2008, Shane's mother Mary, his girlfriend Jenna, his brother Anthony, and his cousin took part in Crime Call, a TV program that reconstructs unsolved crimes and appeals for information. In a heartbreaking segment, the Geoghegans and Jenna faced the cameras, talked about who Shane was, and pleaded for anyone with knowledge to come forward. The program even showed a reenactment of the shooting in Dooradoyle, hoping to jar loose new witnesses or leads. It was an act of great courage and love, turning private grief into public action, and it kept Shane's case in the national spotlight. Tips did begin to flow. People who might have been too afraid to speak up before found motivation now. The Gardaí offered witness protection for anyone with useful information, knowing the fear that the mere name Dundon could evoke in Limerick. They also turned to some newer tactics. Notably, detectives scoured social media. In 2008, that meant platforms like Bebo, which was popular in Ireland at the time. Some younger gang associates were brazenly posting on their Bebo pages, indirectly bragging or dropping hints about their lifestyles, and investigators actually managed to track certain suspects' movements and connections through these online profiles, demonstrating how even criminals' social media vanity could be exploited. One senior officer later lamented how these sites were glorifying gun crime among youth, even as they inadvertently provided clues. Still, solid evidence was needed to make arrests stick. Ballistics tests were being rushed on the casings recovered at the scene. CCTV footage from around Dooradoyle was gathered, hoping a camera caught the getaway van on its route. Phone records in that area around the time of the murder were pulled, looking for patterns or connections to known gang members. With intense pressure from Dublin headquarters, the Garda investigation team worked around the clock through the winter. By early 2009, the hard work began to pay off. Several suspects had been identified, and a clearer picture of the plot was emerging. Police learned that the shooter was likely an import, a gang foot soldier brought in from outside Limerick. This made sense. A local gunman might recognize the target by face, or be recognized himself, whereas an outsider could do the deed and slip away anonymously. Suspicion soon zeroed in on a young man from Dublin who had been seen running with the McCarthy-Dundon crew. 23-year-old Barry Doyle of Portland Road, Dublin. Doyle had been laying low since the murder, but he was on the Garda radar. Investigators discovered that just days after the shooting, Doyle abruptly flew out of Ireland to Turkey, perhaps a hasty getaway. From abroad, he nervously phoned friends to ask what the newspapers were saying about the killing. One conversation, later recounted in court, had Doyle's female friend telling him, "They know it's you because they say it's a very close associate of Patrick Doyle." Patrick Doyle was Barry's brother, indeed a known associate of the Dundon gang, and media speculation was already pointing fingers at that faction. Barry's response on the phone was defiant. "They have no proof," he said. But privately, he must have felt the walls closing in. On February 24th, 2009, roughly 3 months after Shane's murder, Gardaí made their move. Acting on carefully gathered evidence and intelligence, they arrested Barry Doyle in Limerick on suspicion of the murder. That same day, they also arrested Doyle's girlfriend, 21-year-old Victoria Gunnery, in Dublin on suspicion of withholding information. The young mother had been in frequent contact with Barry and might know details about his involvement. Both were brought in for intensive questioning at Limerick's Roxborough Road Garda station, the nerve centre of the investigation. What unfolded next was a psychological chess match between detectives and the prime suspect. Over several days, Barry Doyle was interrogated a staggering 23 times. Teams of Garda interviewers rotated in and out, pressing him for the truth. At first, Doyle denied everything, sticking to a story that he had nothing to do with the shooting. Hours turned into days. He likely thought he could outlast the detectives, but the Gardaí had patience and strategy on their side. They confronted Doyle with inconsistencies, with travel records, such as his sudden trip to Turkey, with whatever forensic links they had, like the recovered bullet casings that they knew matched a Glock. They also played on his conscience, and on the one soft spot he had, his family. Doyle was a father of 3 young children, one with Miss Gunnery. His infant daughter had serious health problems, a heart condition, and was due for a critical medical scan right around that time. Detectives subtly reminded him of this reality, appealing to his humanity. They also let him know that Victoria, the mother of his baby, was in custody and unable to be with their sick child. By the second day of interrogation, Doyle was visibly torn. In one session, his solicitor Michael O'Donnell actually approached investigators with a proposition. Doyle would confess if the Gardaí released Victoria Gunnery so she could go home to the baby. It was an unusual offer, essentially attempting to barter a confession for his girlfriend's freedom. The police had to tread carefully. Any whiff of a deal could render a confession inadmissible later. The lead detectives flatly refused to make a trade, noting that such an inducement would undermine the case. Still, the conversation itself was important. Doyle now knew that confessing might help get his partner out sooner, even without an official deal. And the investigators' persistent empathy, talking about doing the right thing for Shane's family and for his own, was chipping away at him. They told him straight. An innocent man was dead, and his family deserved the truth. By the 15th interview, something cracked. In the 15th interrogation on February 26, 2009, Barry Doyle finally bowed his head and spoke the words the Gardaí had been waiting to hear. He confessed to the murder of Shane Geoghegan. The floodgates opened. Doyle proceeded to give a chillingly detailed account of the shooting, details that only the killer would know and which matched the evidence perfectly. He admitted that he had been the gunman, that he fired 7 or 8 times at Shane. He described chasing Shane into the backyard and shooting him point blank in the back of the head. He even mentioned how his Glock pistol had jammed and how he had to clear it a couple of times to continue firing, which corresponded exactly with the live rounds found at the scene. Barry Doyle confessed that it was all a mistake. He thought Shane was someone else. Realizing the enormity of what he'd done, Doyle expressed remorse. He said he was sorry for killing Shane. In a poignant gesture, after making his first admission, Doyle removed a set of white plastic rosary beads from around his neck and handed them to the officers, asking that they be given to Mr. Geoghegan's ma. It was as if, in that moment, he understood the grief he had caused and was seeking some form of absolution or forgiveness. Hardened detectives, used to dealing with criminals, were struck by this act, a brief human moment amid a grim task. The confession was a major breakthrough. Gardaí carefully recorded Doyle's statements, likely on video and in writing, to preserve every detail as evidence. By the end of those interviews, they had what they needed to charge him formally. And as promised, Victoria Gunnery was released. She would eventually face a minor charge for withholding information, but nothing compared to what Barry was facing. The Gardaí did everything by the book to ensure Doyle's confession would hold up. They made it clear on the record that no threats or promises were made, and indeed later a court would note. Some of the Garda comments during questioning are colloquial, to say the least, but there are no threats uttered. Neither is any explicit promise or inducement offered. Barry Doyle, a 23-year-old former bricklayer and small-time criminal, had confessed of his own accord under the weight of evidence and moral appeal. He knew what he was doing, a judge would later remark. By the weekend, Barry Doyle stood before a special sitting of the District Court in Limerick. On February 28, 2009, he was officially charged with the murder of Shane Geoghegan. Images of Doyle, handcuffed, flanked by detectives, hit the news, giving the public a first look at the man accused of killing Shane. Doyle looked tired and disheveled, the weight of a potential life sentence surely on his mind. No bail is possible on a murder charge in Ireland, so he was remanded in custody to await trial. Outside the courthouse, angry onlookers heckled him, and Shane's family watched in stoic silence. This arrest was a significant step toward justice, but it was just the beginning of a long legal road. The question remained, who ordered Doyle to carry out this killing? That part of the puzzle was not publicly answered yet, though many had suspicions. The name Dundon swirled in the media and local conversation, but no charges had been filed against any gang boss at that point. Investigators knew that to truly get justice for Shane and peace for Limerick, they would have to bring down not just the gunman, but the ones who sent him. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and it wasn't until early 2011, over 2 years after the murder, that Barry Doyle finally went on trial for Shane Geoghegan's killing. The case was heard in the Central Criminal Court in Dublin, because all murder trials in Ireland are handled at the national level, often with a jury drawn from a wider pool. The long delay in reaching trial was due in part to the meticulous preparation required for such a high-profile case. Forensic evidence, witness statements, including Doyle's own confession, and legal arguments over what evidence would be admissible, all had to be sorted. Shane's family attended every day of the proceedings, determined to see justice done. When the trial commenced in January 2011, Barry Doyle pleaded not guilty, despite his earlier confession. This was not unexpected. It's common for defendants who confess to later retract or challenge those confessions in court. The crux of Doyle's defense was that his admissions to the Gardaí were not truly voluntary. His legal team, led by defense counsel Martin O'Rourke SC, argued that Doyle had been induced or coerced into confessing, due to psychological pressure and implied promises about his girlfriend's situation. Essentially, they claimed Doyle only said he shot Shane because he believed it was the only way to help Victoria Gunnery and their ill child, and that Garda interrogators had manipulated his emotions. The defense maintained that without that improper pressure, Doyle would never have confessed, suggesting that the confession should be viewed as unreliable or even thrown out entirely. The prosecution, of course, argued the opposite, that Doyle's confession was detailed, accurate, and freely given once he was confronted with the truth. They emphasized how closely his story matched the forensic evidence, like the number of shots and the jammed gun detail. They also noted that it was Doyle's own solicitor who had first broached the idea of a quid pro quo to release his girlfriend, not the police. In other words, if anyone planted the idea of confess to help your girlfriend, it was Doyle's side, a tactical move that didn't ultimately bind the Gardaí. The detectives, for their part, testified that while they empathized with Doyle about his family, they made no threats or deals and certainly didn't brutalize him. The tapes of the interviews were there for the court to review, showing no overt coercion. Yes, the Gardaí had appealed to his conscience. They appealed to his sense of sympathy for the Geoghegan family, to his sense of morality, as one judge later put it, but that's considered fair game in interrogation. Over several weeks, the jury heard all the evidence. Neighbours recounting the gunshots, Jenna Barry tearfully describing hearing the wheels screech and finding out her boyfriend had been killed, forensic experts explaining the ballistic findings, and the entire saga of Doyle's confession. They even heard from Doyle's then-girlfriend, Victoria Gunnery, who recounted the suspicious text Barry sent her on the night of the murder. At 8 p.m, he told her he was going to turn off his phone because he had something to do. That text strongly suggested premeditation. Ms. Gunnery also testified about her chilling exchange with Doyle after the murder, how he told her to read the teletext in the morning to see news of a shooting, and how he later called from Turkey and she informed him that people were saying a close associate of his brother was suspected. These details painted a picture of a man who knew he was involved in something terrible and tried to cover his tracks. By late March 2011, the case went to the jury. 10 jurors, in fact, because 2 had been lost during the trial, one due to a family illness, another due to an unmovable travel commitment. In Ireland, a criminal verdict must usually be unanimous, and with only 10 jurors remaining, all 10 had to agree. The jurors retired to deliberate, and they deliberated. Hours turned into days. The tension mounted. The judge, Mr. Justice Paul Carney, even acknowledged that this was becoming one of the longest deliberations in Irish legal history for a single-charge murder case. After 15.5 hours of discussion over several days, the foreman finally sent a note to the judge. The jury would like to know how to proceed if we believe it will never be possible to agree on a unanimous verdict. Justice Carney called them back in and gently told them the procedure. If they truly couldn't all agree, they should write "cannot agree" on the verdict form and sign it. There was a pause. Then the foreman requested a pen. In that moment, everyone in court realized the outcome. Shortly thereafter, the form was handed up. The jury was hung, hopelessly deadlocked. They could not reach a unanimous decision. It was an unexpected twist. After such a strong prosecution case, how could this happen? Later reporting revealed that the jurors had been split, with some harboring doubts about the confession's voluntariness. Perhaps 1 or 2 jurors found the defense's coercion argument persuasive enough to prevent unanimity. We don't know the exact vote count. Jury deliberations are secret. But clearly at least 1 juror refused to convict, and at least 1 refused to acquit. As per Irish law, a majority verdict wasn't an option with only 10 jurors. It had to be unanimous or nothing. So on March 23, 2011, the judge thanked the jury for their service and formally discharged them, even going so far as to excuse them from any future jury duty due to the trying nature of the case. For Shane's family, who had sat through every agonizing day, this was devastating. They were seen in court holding back tears, heads bowed in disappointment when the hung jury was announced. They would have to endure it all again in a retrial. Barry Doyle was led back into custody, neither convicted nor cleared, just in limbo. Outside the courthouse, he was the target of shouts like "coward" from some bystanders, but in the eyes of the law, he remained presumed innocent, awaiting a new trial date. The prosecution immediately vowed to retry the case. They had come so close, they would not let it drop. And indeed, the evidence, especially Doyle's own words, was too substantial to ignore. The Director of Public Prosecutions scheduled a retrial for early 2012. Importantly, the judge allowed that Doyle's confession could be admitted as evidence again, rejecting defense motions to exclude it. This meant the state could present the same damning admissions to a new jury. But they might adjust their strategy, perhaps emphasizing even more the corroboration of the confession, to assure jurors it was truthful and unforced. Sure enough, in February 2012, Barry Doyle faced his second trial for Shane's murder. This time, lessons from the first trial were put into practice. The prosecution systematically laid out how no one had forced Doyle to confess, highlighting that he had legal counsel at all times and that he himself initiated the idea that by talking he could help his girlfriend. They played recordings of the Garda interviews, letting jurors hear Doyle's tone, which, according to those who've heard them, did not sound like a man under threat of violence, but rather a man grappling with his conscience. They reminded the jury that Doyle's solicitor's attempt to broker a deal was not accepted by police, meaning Doyle chose to talk without any guaranteed benefit. The defense still argued coercion, but perhaps their thunder was somewhat stolen by the prior hung jury. The prosecution could now proactively counter those points. This time, after a shorter deliberation, the jury came back with a clear decision. On February 15, 2012, Barry Doyle was found guilty of the murder of Shane Geoghegan. The verdict was unanimous, delivered by 11 jurors, the standard full jury of 12 minus 1 excused during deliberations, after about 6 hours of discussion. As the clerk read out the word guilty, Shane's family gripped one another's hands in quiet relief. Some had tears in their eyes, a mix of sorrow and gratitude that justice had finally been done on this part of the case. Barry Doyle, then 26 years old and a father of 3, showed little emotion. Under Irish law, a murder conviction carries a mandatory life sentence. Justice Garrett Sheehan formally pronounced the only sentence he could: life imprisonment for Doyle. "There is only one sentence this court can impose," the judge said, "and that's life in prison, With that, Doyle was led away to begin serving what in Ireland typically means at least 15 to 20 years behind bars, if not the rest of his natural life. Afterwards, Justice Sheehan took a moment to commend the jury for their service, acknowledging how difficult such cases are. Outside the court, speaking quietly to reporters, Shane's family expressed their thanks to the Gardaí and the legal team. They were relieved that the man who pulled the trigger was now held accountable. However, their statements were measured. They did not celebrate. How could they? Shane was still gone forever. "There are no winners here," one family member said softly. "But at least now we know who did it, and that person is paying for it." Still, a bigger question loomed. Who sent Barry Doyle? The family, the public, and indeed the Gardaí all wanted the mastermind brought to justice. And the answer to that question would soon unfold in a dramatic way, thanks to a brave young woman who decided to break the gangster code of silence. Throughout Barry Doyle's trials, an underlying narrative was present, but not fully explored in court. Doyle was just the gunman. Everyone knew some gang boss had ordered this hit. Suspicion had always centered on the McCarthy-Dundon crime family, specifically one of the Dundon brothers, as being behind the plot to kill John McNamara. However, suspicion is not proof. At the time of Doyle's conviction in early 2012, no one had been charged as the mastermind of Shane's murder. The Gardaí, of course, had continued investigating the conspiracy, gathering any evidence they could that might tie the higher-ups to the crime. The big breakthrough came from someone on the inside, April Collins. April was a 26-year-old Limerick woman who had intimate knowledge of the Dundon gang's dealings, because she had been part of their world. For about a decade, April was in a relationship with Gerard Ger Dundon, one of the infamous Dundon brothers. She had 3 children with Ger Dundon and had been like family to the Dundons, privy to conversations and plans that few outsiders were. But by 2011, that relationship had fallen apart in spectacular fashion. Ger Dundon was in prison on unrelated charges, and April had split from him amidst much acrimony. In fact, after Ger's jailing, April alleged that his brothers, John and Wayne Dundon, began threatening her life, trying to intimidate her into silence about various crimes. Feeling endangered and betrayed, April Collins made a fateful decision. She approached the Gardaí to become a witness against the Dundons. April's journey from insider to state witness was not immediate or easy. Initially, she just wanted protection from the gang's threats. The Gardaí assigned her a liaison officer, Detective Garda James Geoghegan, for her safety. As April later recounted in court, she confided to her mother that, "I knew some things about murders." She was tormented by her knowledge of violent plots, including the one that took Shane's life. Finally, in April 2012, just 2 months after Doyle's conviction, she decided to tell all. She contacted Garda Geoghegan and arranged to give a formal statement under caution, meaning anything she said could potentially incriminate herself as well, though she was seeking immunity. Over a series of interviews with senior detectives, notably Detective Superintendent Jim Brown, April Collins spilled the secrets she had carried. And they were explosive. April revealed that in the day or two leading up to Shane Geoghegan's murder, she was present at a meeting where the hit on John McNamara was being organised. This meeting took place at the Dundon family's house on Hyde Road in Limerick City, the stronghold of the McCarthy-Dundon gang. In the room, according to April, were several key players: John Dundon, Ger's brother and the presumed shot caller, Ger Dundon himself, Nathan Killeen, a young gang associate, Mickey Mike Casey, another associate, and the hired gun from Dublin, Barry Doyle. April, as Ger's partner, was around and overheard much of the discussion. She testified that John Dundon was effectively running the show. He had been tracking John McNamara's comings and goings and had gathered a lot of information about McNamara's routine. He told the group he had sourced a gun for the job and arranged a car. Then he singled out Barry Doyle for the task of killing McNamara and Nathan Killeen for driving the getaway car. He told the men he had everything sorted. "The gun is there, you kill him," April recalled, quoting John Dundon's orders to Doyle. This chilling directive matched exactly what investigators had suspected and what Doyle's confession implied. April's testimony was essentially providing the missing link, a first-hand account tying John Dundon to the orchestration of the murder. But April didn't stop there. She also recounted what happened after the murder, which she learned through direct observation and conversations within the gang. She testified that once the hit was carried out in the early hours of November 9, 2008, the Dundon crew initially thought their mission was accomplished, that McNamara was dead. She said that her brother-in-law and John's brother, Ger Dundon, received a phone call in the hours following the shooting, alerting him that the deed was done. In response, April drove Ger to meet up with John Dundon and Barry Doyle at a rendezvous point, behind a restaurant on the Dublin Road in Limerick. There in the dark, the group convened to confirm the kill. John Dundon was eager for details. According to April, John was saying John McNamara was dead. He believed they had eliminated their enemy. To be sure, John Dundon pulled out a phone and called someone. In fact, he called Philip Colopy, a senior member of the rival Colopy gang, and a close associate of McNamara. John intended to gloat. As April described it, John used Doyle's phone to call Colopy so he could slag him, taunt him, about McNamara's supposed death. It was during this phone conversation that reality struck. Colopy apparently informed John Dundon that the wrong man had been killed. One can imagine the colour draining from John's face as he realised their hitman had murdered an uninvolved civilian, not their target. April Collins testified that John Dundon panicked upon learning of the mistake. He immediately turned on Barry Doyle, becoming very angry and violent toward him. At that late-night meeting behind the restaurant, John barked at Doyle to describe the victim. Doyle described the victim. He said he was big, the way John described him. Barry insisted, it was him. I'm sure it was him. But John Dundon's fury only grew as the realization sank in that Barry had killed the wrong person. April's account depicts John roaring in anger at the botched job. The triumphant mood flipped to one of panic and dread. They knew this mistake would bring enormous heat from law enforcement and potentially deadly retaliation from rivals. Indeed, April said John Dundon was livid about the carelessness of the whole thing, blaming the poor description and the mistaken identity for this disaster. April Collins' testimony was dynamite. She implicated John Dundon directly as the one who ordered, planned, and then reacted to the murder of Shane Geoghegan. Her inside knowledge gave prosecutors exactly what they needed to move up the chain of command. In May 2012, armed with April's statements and corroboration from others she helped bring forward, the Gardaí finally made their move against the gang boss. On August 17, 2012, John Dundon, then 29, was charged with the murder of Shane Geoghegan, not as the shooter, but as the one who directed it. Because of the extreme security concerns and the potential for jury intimidation given Dundon's notoriety, the case was sent to the Special Criminal Court, SCC. The SCC is a 3-judge panel with no jury, typically used in Ireland for terrorism or organised crime cases where tampering with jurors is a risk. This was a clear sign of the threat level surrounding the trial. The state was taking no chances after seeing what happened with the first Doyle jury and knowing the Dundons' fearsome reputation in Limerick. John Dundon's trial in the Special Criminal Court would become a spectacle in its own right, as he pulled every trick in the book to delay and derail the proceedings. It was scheduled to begin in June 2013, but in the run-up, John engaged in what the prosecution called cynical ploys to buy time. First, his lawyers went to the High Court claiming they had been bombarded with so much evidence, CCTV, phone records, documents, only a month before trial that they needed an extra 500 working days to review it. The High Court did not grant such an extreme delay, but it foreshadowed Dundon's strategy, to make the process as difficult as possible. Sure enough, the night before the trial was to start, John Dundon was suddenly hospitalized, claiming he was on a hunger strike and feeling unwell. The next day, June 4th, 2013, he was wheeled into court in dramatic fashion, in a wheelchair, wearing nothing but a pair of dark boxer shorts. He refused to wear prison clothes and said he had no access to his own clothes after being discharged from hospital. It was a surreal scene. A notorious gang figure sitting nearly naked before the judges. His counsel explained the situation, and while eyebrows were raised, the court proceeded. A few weeks later, on the opening day of the trial, July 2nd, 2013, Dundon again caused a disruption. He claimed he was illiterate and fired his legal team right as proceedings began, saying he would represent himself. This is a known stalling tactic. Representing himself would likely prompt an adjournment for him to prepare, even though, in truth, it would just create chaos. The judges saw through it. That very day, Dundon also mysteriously suffered a head injury in custody and was taken to the hospital, delaying the start of testimony. Once recovered and back in court, Dundon ultimately allowed counsel to represent him again. The judges insisted the trial move forward. Despite these antics, by mid-July 2013, the trial was properly underway. Key witnesses took the stand under heavy protection. The atmosphere was tense. Armed gardaí stood guard, and the Collins family, April and her sisters, were clearly nervous yet determined. Indeed, April Collins testified that she and her siblings were terrified of John Dundon. "I dread these people," she said, describing how she lived in fear. She and her siblings had been relocated for their safety. It was obvious that testifying against the Dundons meant effectively giving up their lives in Limerick due to the threat of reprisals. This illustrates the immense courage it took for them to speak out. When April took the stand in late July 2013, her direct testimony was a bombshell, much of which we've recounted above. She laid out the planning meeting, the botched murder, and John Dundon's role. The defence, led by veteran barrister Brendan Nix SC, cross-examined her aggressively over multiple days. Nix tried to portray April as an unreliable character. After all, she had a checkered past, including a conviction for intimidating a witness in another case, for which she got a suspended sentence. He suggested she had been granted immunity and was living a charmed life, avoiding jail by helping the state. April pushed back, saying, "Nobody should have to live the life I live, under Garda protection 24/7. Her voice quivered as she described being constantly guarded, moved to secret locations, separated from normal life. She flatly denied any sweetheart deal. Indeed, she was voluntarily in this predicament because her conscience couldn't bear what she knew. Mr. Nix also hammered her about the night of the murder itself. He pointed out that April had effectively had a couple of opportunities to prevent the killing, an uncomfortable truth. You see, on the night before Shane's murder, April had gone with J.R. Dundon, John's brother, to check into a hotel, essentially to establish an alibi for J.R. That same night, they were stopped by Gardaí in Limerick twice, possibly routine stops or maybe Garda surveillance of known gang members. Nix pressed her. "Didn't those stops give you 2 chances to tell the police that a murder was about to happen?" It was a damning line of questioning. April responded in a tortured tone that she couldn't go to the Gardaí then. "I'd have been killed myself and my family would have been killed," she said. She admitted she knew at the time that an innocent man's life was in danger and that an innocent man is dead as a result, but insisted that speaking up earlier would have signed her own death warrant. "Do you feel bad about it?" Nix asked. April answered, "I feel very sorry for the family." It was a heart-rending moment. She acknowledged the weight of that guilt, even if she felt she had no real choice back then. This exchange highlighted the climate of terror that the Dundon gang created. Even someone who foresaw the tragedy felt too frightened to stop it. Another key witness was April's younger sister, Lisa Collins. Lisa corroborated aspects of April's story and added her own observations. She testified that a couple of weeks before Shane's murder, she too heard John Dundon talk about planning a killing. While her details were not as complete as April's, having multiple family members come forward with similar accounts bolstered the prosecution. It also showed that, within the extended Collins family and their circle, people had been quietly aware of the Dundons' violent plots, but were previously too scared to speak out. Additionally, Detective Garda evidence and other corroborating testimony were presented. Phone records showed communication patterns consistent with April's narrative. For example, calls between the Dundons and Barry Doyle around the time of the murder, and that call to Philip Colopy afterward. CCTV footage likely placed the Renault Espace or the movements of the suspects on the night in question, although specifics weren't widely reported. The prosecution emphasized that they were not relying solely on the word of the Collins sisters. They had a good deal of evidence to corroborate their testimony, as the judges later noted. For instance, one detective testified about surveillance of the Dundons that matched April's timeline, like the fact Gardaí did stop Jer and April that night, which lent credence to her story. Another witness, a former associate, may have been a former associate who also gave supporting evidence, possibly confirming that John Dundon had motive and intent to target McNamara. That witness was later recorded in a prison phone call with Lisa Collins, which the defense tried to use to question motives, but that's getting ahead to the appeal. After a 3-week trial full of drama, the judges of the Special Criminal Court were convinced. On August 13, 2013, the SCC delivered its verdict. John Dundon was guilty of the murder of Shane Geoghegan. In a lengthy 84-page judgment read out in court, the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Nicholas Kearns, said the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The court had no doubt that Dundon played a central role in ordering and organizing the killing. They found the Collins sisters to be credible witnesses despite the defense's attacks on their character. Any issues with their past did not erase the believable, detailed account they gave of the murder plot. The attempt by the defense to suggest April and others framed Dundon to keep him locked up, via that recorded phone conversation implying they wanted him to get more than 10 years, was dismissed as having no impact that would undermine the fairness of the trial. The court ruled that even if Dundon's lawyers didn't use that phone recording back in 2013, it wouldn't have changed the outcome, because the evidence of Dundon's guilt was solid. John Dundon, now officially a convicted murderer at age 30, received the mandatory life sentence. As the verdict was announced, Dundon reportedly sat listening to music through headphones, barely paying attention. He had behaved with contempt for the court throughout, and this moment was no exception. He only took off his headphones briefly when the judges pronounced him guilty. It was a display of defiance or indifference, perhaps for show. His lawyer, Brendan Nix, in a final gesture, told the court that Dundon deeply regretted that Shane Geoghegan lost his life in this way, but maintained he had no hand, act, or part in it. In other words, he still proclaimed innocence, even as he offered hollow sympathies to the Geoghegan family, sympathies which, as Nix acknowledged, the family was unlikely to accept. Dundon's lack of an apology or accountability was noted. One report mentioned that through his lawyer Dundon would only express regrets, but no actual apology, which rang entirely false. In a show of quiet dignity, Shane's family declined to make any victim impact statement to the court. Through prosecutor Tom O'Connell SC, Shane's mother Mary simply conveyed that the facts of the case speak for themselves. They did not wish to say more. This understated response underscored that for the Geoghegans, this wasn't a moment of celebration, just one of solemn justice. They had sat through yet another trial, hearing the grim details of how Shane was wrongly marked for death, and they saw a second dangerous man held accountable. That was enough for them. With the convictions of Barry Doyle and John Dundon, the main perpetrators of the Shane Geoghegan murder were behind bars for life. It was a hard-won victory for law and order in Limerick. The Gardaí and prosecutors had demonstrated that even the most feared gang leaders could be brought to justice, especially when brave witnesses dared to come forward. The public breathed a sigh of relief, one less violent figure on the streets, one more sign that the cycle of gangland terror in Limerick could be broken. In the months and years following, there were several legal aftershocks. Appeals were filed by both Doyle and Dundon, as was expected. Barry Doyle appealed his conviction on numerous grounds, 27 points in all, primarily rehashing that his confession should have been deemed inadmissible due to alleged inducement. In June 2015, the Irish Court of Appeal rejected Doyle's appeal entirely. The appellate judges were unambiguous. Doyle's trial was fair and his conviction safe. They pointed out that Doyle was the one who, via his solicitor, floated the idea of confessing if his girlfriend was released, indicating he acted with legal advice and a clear mind. They also quoted lines from the interview tapes showing Gardaí did not cross the line. They made no threats or direct promises, only appealed to his better nature. Thus, Doyle remained in prison to serve out his life term. In Ireland, life means the rest of your natural life subject to parole considerations after about 12 plus years. As of 2025, Doyle is still incarcerated, having been in for 13 years. Doyle even took his case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, arguing that his right to a lawyer was initially restricted. He didn't have a lawyer present for the first phase of questioning, a point which had been litigated in Irish courts. In 2019, the ECHR did acknowledge a technical violation regarding prompt access to counsel, but crucially found that it did not irretrievably prejudice the overall fairness of the trial. The European Court noted the strong public interest in prosecuting such a serious crime of gangland murder, and ultimately rejected Doyle's attempt to overturn his conviction. In sum, every avenue Doyle pursued ended with confirmation of his guilt. John Dundon also appealed his 2013 conviction, but he faced an uphill battle given it was a judge-only trial, no jury issues, and a very thorough verdict. His initial appeals were unsuccessful. Over a decade later, in December 2024, 16 years after Shane's murder, John Dundon made a final bid to overturn his conviction, claiming new evidence had emerged. His lawyers pointed to a recorded prison phone call between witness Lisa Collins and a one-time associate which they said fell through the cracks in 2013. In that call, Lisa and the associate allegedly discussed how long a prison term for Dundon would be enough, and noted that 10 years wouldn't be sufficient, implying, according to the defense, a motive to ensure Dundon got a life sentence rather than a shorter one. Essentially, Dundon's team argued that if they'd had that call, they could have used it to undermine the Collins sisters by suggesting they conspired to put Dundon away for life. However, in December 2024, the Court of Appeal firmly dismissed this, stating there was no miscarriage of justice. Justice John Edwards noted the phone recording wasn't in the prosecution's possession at trial, so there was no bad faith. And regardless, it wouldn't have changed the judges' minds. The judges commented that fear and resentment toward Dundon by witnesses was understandable given his gang's reign of terror, and the trial court had already treated their evidence with caution. With substantial corroborating evidence in the case, the appeal judges saw no reason to doubt the conviction's safety. Thus, John Dundon remains in prison serving life, his last-ditch appeal exhausted. He will be in his 40s before he can even hope for any consideration of early release. And given his record and lack of remorse, it's likely he will spend many decades behind bars. While justice prevailed in the courts, the true measure of Shane Geoghegan's legacy can be seen in how his community responded and remembered him. Shane's death became a catalyst for positive action in Limerick. Within a year of his murder, in late 2009, Shane's family and friends established the Shane Geoghegan Trust, a charitable initiative aimed at steering young people away from crime and into sports and creative activities. They wanted to ensure that something good could grow from the sorrow, that other families might be spared the pain they endured. The trust ran community-based programs for children in Limerick's tougher neighbourhoods, offering coaching, workshops, and events as alternatives to antisocial behaviour. One flagship program was Street Games, which brought sports to the streets of areas like Kilterore, Shane's own area, Moyross, and Ballinacurra, the very communities touched by violence, in partnership with the Limerick City Sports Partnership. Hundreds of kids participated, finding mentorship and camaraderie through play, instead of getting drawn into gang culture. The trust even drew support from abroad. Niall Quinn, a famous Irish soccer star and then chairman of Sunderland AFC, got involved and organised a charity soccer match at Limerick's Thomond Park to raise funds. It was truly a community rallying around a legacy of hope. After 3 years of making a difference, the Shane Geoghegan Trust felt it had achieved its initial aims. In November 2012, on the 4th anniversary of Shane's passing, the Geoghegan family announced that the trust would cease operations and distribute its remaining funds to other local youth charities and schools. Shane's mother Mary expressed profound gratitude to the people of Limerick for their unwavering support of the trust's mission. The decision to wind down the dedicated trust was in part because its projects had been successfully integrated into other local initiatives, and the family wanted Shane's name remembered not just for the tragedy, but for the positive actions taken. Shane's family and close friends' involvement in the trust was to ensure a positive memory of Shane because of the danger that he might be remembered only by the manner of his dying, said the trust's chairman. It was a poignant full-circle moment, even as the legal saga was wrapping up around the same time. Shane's memory continues to be honoured in Limerick. Garryowen Rugby Club's gesture of retiring the number 3 jersey for the season he died was later complemented by more enduring tributes. The club and community established annual sports events in his name, including a rugby tournament and a pitch and putt golf tournament, ensuring that each year people come together in friendly competition to celebrate Shane's passion for sport and life. As Shane's brother Anthony noted, these memorials help ensure Shane's life as he lived. It will be remembered, and his memory passed on fondly by his friends. Indeed, to those who knew him, Shane is remembered not as a crime victim, but as the warm, upbeat guy who loved rugby, loved his hometown, and always had time for others. The broader impact of Shane Geoghegan's murder and the ensuing justice was significant for Ireland. Along with a handful of other shocking crimes around that time, notably the subsequent murder of Roy Collins in Limerick in 2009, another innocent victim of the Dundon gang's vengeance, it spurred changes in how authorities tackled organised crime. The government moved to strengthen laws. Within months of Shane's death, new legislation was introduced to empower law enforcement. The Criminal Justice Amendment Act 2009, for instance, allowed more use of the Special Criminal Court for gang cases, reflecting the approach taken with John Dundon. There was also increased funding for Garda surveillance and witness protection, acknowledging that without protected witnesses like April Collins, taking down gang leaders would be near impossible. Public sentiment in Limerick, once cowed by gang intimidation, began to shift. People were more willing to engage with community policing, give anonymous tips, or testify under protection, seeing that the state could keep witnesses safe and successfully prosecute gangsters. By the late 2000s and 10s, Limerick's infamous gang feud had largely burned out. Many of its main actors were imprisoned or deceased. The McCarthy-Dundon faction was decimated by convictions, not only for Shane's case, but others, including the Roy Collins case, which saw John's brother Wayne Dundon and cohort Nathan Killeen convicted of murder in 2014. The city started shedding the Stab City image as gun murders dropped dramatically. While crime never disappears entirely, Limerick in 2025 is a far safer place than it was in 2008. Shane Geoghegan's name is indelibly part of that narrative, a reminder of the innocent lives at stake and the community's refusal to surrender to fear. The story of Shane Geoghegan is a heartbreaking tale of an innocent life lost in a reckless gang war. It's also a story of resilience, of a family and community that turned grief into positive action, and of brave witnesses who conquered fear to speak out. Shane's life was stolen in a flash of violence, but his legacy endures in the lives he touched and the changes that followed. As we reflect on that dark November night and all that came after, the facts of the case do indeed speak for themselves, just as his mother said. They speak of a senseless tragedy, a young man who should never have died, and they speak of a hard-won justice that was anything but senseless. In the end, Limerick stood up to its demons. Shane Geoghegan's community ensured that his death would not be just another statistic in a gangland feud, but a catalyst for reclaiming their city from violence. And that is a legacy worth remembering. Thank you so much for listening. As a new podcast, we very much appreciate your support. If you're interested in rarely heard global murder cases like this one, we encourage you to give us a follow, or even rate us 5 stars on your podcast app. If we may be so bold, it would help us out a lot. See you next time.